So just in time for International Workers' Day, I thought I'd make a really quick and simple video highlighting the differences between a socialistic system and a capitalistic system. And I know a lot of people say that the USA is socialistic now, but certainly we aren't as socialistic as Cuba. And I'd really like to just compare the USA and Cuba for this purpose. The Cuban economy uh, is worth about 115 billion in goods and services. They have a labor force of 5 million, and most of that is in the public sector. About 80% of their economy is in the public sector. The U.S. has a total economy of $15 trillion worth of goods and services, and most of that's in the private sector, about 70%. Now, our private sector in the U.S. in total is 344 times the size of the private sector of Cuba, and our public sector in total is 72 times the size of Cuba. So any way you slice it, we are far larger, which means that we should have a lot more advantages than Cuba when it comes to uh, economies of scale and specialization of labor. For instance, if you're in a factory with 10 people and you're all building a custom-made car, you could have 10 different uh, occupations, and each person can specialize in a different part of building that car and get much better. Uh, in Cuba, they don't have those advantages. Everyone sort of has to do much more um, in theory, but we'll see by the end of this video that that's not really the case. Um, Now, even from a per capita standpoint, the private sector of the U.S., we spend about 10 times more per person than Cuba, and in the public sector, we spend about twice as much per Cuba. So not only do we have more specialization in the U.S. in theory, about 30 times more since our labor force is about 30 times the size, but we also have way more purchasing power than Cuba. So we should really be dominating Cuba either way you slice it, from either a socialistic standpoint or a capitalistic standpoint. Um, and yet, when you look at what we spend our money on in the U.S., a lot of the public sector goes towards waste, such as the military. And the reason I say it's waste is because when you look at our spending and our allies' spending versus our relative threats in our different hemispheres, the only ally that or group of allies that could really um, be looked upon as being in trouble would be Japan and South Korea and Australia out in the Pacific. But even then, it's only about, a $80 billion gap versus uh, a $600 billion gap for the US and our supposed threats in the Western Hemisphere. And yet we're also supposedly friendly with China, considering we trade extensively with them, and we even conduct military operations now with Russia. So all this military spending is almost a complete waste, whereas with Cuba you could say it's somewhat necessary, considering the U.S. heavily sanctions them, and we even launched an invasion with the Bay of Pigs not too long ago. And we spend far more money, and we have nuclear weapons, which they don't have in Cuba. So it's really quite ridiculous. And I would say about $500 billion of what we spend in the U.S. on our military is a complete waste of money. But anyhow, this is what really gets me is in the US we train about 2.3 doctors per 1,000 people, and in Cuba they train 5.91 doctors per 1,000 people. So from their private sector, they train about 20 times more doctors per dollar, and from their public sector they train about 5 times more doctors per dollar. So either way, considering the US is supposed to have way more specialization and we have way more money to spend, which gives us way more economies of scale. And the fact that we also supposedly have way more competition since it's split between the public and the private sector in the 50 states, which also compete with one another publicly. We're not even about half of where they're at in Cuba when it comes to training doctors. And more importantly, what do doctors do? Well, doctors are supposed to make us live longer, so some people might say, well, our doctors are much better in the US, even though we don't have as many. Well, even from that standpoint, life expectancy in the US versus life expectancy in Cuba is about the exact same. And maybe you could say, well, our lives are much happier in the US than they are in Cuba. Even then, if you look at the suicide rate, USA and Cuba are about the same, especially when you compare them with France and the Netherlands. You see a greater disparity between those two countries, which are both more socialistic than the US, than you do between the US and Cuba. So either socialism and capitalism doesn't matter that much, or Cuba is using their resources much more effectively than we are in the US, by a order of magnitude of about 5 times greater more effectiveness than we are in the US, which to me would say that socialism is the superior system because it's not about how much money you have, it's about how long you live and how happy uh, you live your life. And that's what this country was based on, was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not um, life, liberty, and the pursuit of money. In fact, that was the key distinction between our philosophy that we created with Thomas Jefferson and Locke's philosophy, is that we should care more about happiness than property. And if you know anything about philosophy, then you know that's the case. So I don't really understand why Major League Baseball is suspending people for making pro-Castro remarks either, considering that's a violation of the First Amendment. And really, I think the U.S. is much more Stalinistic than Cuba is, since we're conducting military parades in South Korea and all over the world, and Cuba is just minding their own business, following the principles of our founding fathers even more than we are. So that's what I wanted to do for my International Workers' Day video, and I hope you liked it. Take care.